Well, good morning and welcome to the Footlight Broadcast. My name is Brian O'Kelly. I will be your host for today's program and hopefully today's class, and hopefully you'll find it valuable and edifying. It's been 3 weeks since I've been with you, and most of you who are regular listeners to the podcast, viewers of the broadcast, know the reasons why. So I'll jump right into the program today, and we do some introduction and housekeeping, so on. Today we're going to discuss Romans 13, which is the chapter in which Paul discusses the Christian's submission to authority and the Christian's attitude related to government and the purpose of government. And so I think this will be valuable to you. I hope that you'll find it valuable. A couple of housekeeping things before we get right into it. This is listener supported. If you want to help with the broadcast, you can visit footlight.com. You'll find ways to do that there. Thank you, the handful of you who are doing that. Just finished my taxes, got to look at the fact that last year, of course, not much income to the program as it being new, and expenses exceeded what came in. No problem. Happy to do it. But if you want to help, we could grow a little more. There's stars on Facebook if you want to help with that. Most importantly, I'd love to hear from you. The message line, 866-988-8311. You can email me at brian@thefootlight.com, and then comments in the comments section on whichever platform you're watching, listening on. Of course, the audio podcast is the main audience for this, but it is live on Facebook. It is live on YouTube. It is live on Getter, on Twitter, and on Rumble. So whichever platform you're on, welcome. Let's just get into the broadcast. And for those of you who don't know, my mom got to go home to be with Jesus on St. Patrick's Day. And so that's part of why I've been spotty on the broadcast, and hopefully will be more regular going forward. This chapter, as I was saying, is Paul's treatise on government and on being in submission to government. And so let's get right into this question of, is civil disobedience for the Christian? Are we authorized by God, by the Bible, to disobey governmental authorities? Is that something that's okay for the Christian? Are we allowed to say, no, I resist, I won't comply, you're not authority over me, you're not the boss of me, if you will, like little kids say? So let's get right into the Bible. And if you've got your Bibles, you want to grab Romans chapter 13. Romans is the first epistle of Paul after the Gospels. And so jump right in here. And again, I welcome your comments during the broadcast. There's a chat window you can jump into. All right, so let every soul be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. So what is authority? What does this mean when we talk about being under authority? What is authority? Well, there are basically two kinds of authority. Inherent authority, and inherent authority means something that's resident within the authority themselves, within you, and it doesn't come from anywhere else. It's generated within. And the only authority that exists is God himself, that has inherent authority. He receives it from no one. Now, some have said that heads of state have inherent authority as the sovereign over their nations. But what people mean is that they answer to no man. Okay, now, well, that's true. It doesn't mean they aren't answerable to God for everything that they do, for every act of their government. For example, Kim Jong-il, Vladimir Putin, other dictators don't answer to any human beings. However, they will be held responsible by God for what they do. And this is the proper definition of authority. They are not laws unto themselves, although they act that way often. Reformed theologians define sovereignty to indicate that the sovereign dictates every single thing that happens within their jurisdiction. Well, these earthly dictators They don't dictate everything that happens in their jurisdiction. I don't think they get down to the specific acts of specific people at specific moments in an exhaustive fashion, right? In other words, they may not choose the games that children will play on any given day, although they may well choose the games that are legal or illegal and impose punishments as such, right? The Reformed theologian would have the sovereignty of God mean that he controls every single act of every single person at every single moment of history. And I don't believe sovereignty means that. Sovereignty means the right to rule. Now, what is the second kind of authority? The second kind of authority is delegated authority. And all earthly authorities have delegated authority in a defined arena. In the old days, this was called the divine right of kings. And it was a recognition that the authority of the king had come from God. And we're all used to delegated authority, right? For example, the CEO has delegated his or her authority by the board of directors, right? The airline pilot has delegated his or her authority by the airline, right? The pastor has delegated his authority by the church, typically by an elder board. Okay. Now, there are, however, some churches that consider the pastor to be a shepherd called by God position, but even in these churches, there's recognition that the authority of the pastor is delegated, right? I'm delegated authority over my family, right? By God, right? And so, but if you have the CEO of the corporation and he tells me to go wash my car and pick up his dry cleaning, unless that's part of my job description and in the area of authority of the CEO, they're abusing their authority, right? If a pilot who's delegated authority by the airline decides to fly to a different destination than the flight is supposed to go to and do barrel rolls in the passenger jet, he's violating his authority or her authority, right? If a pastor decides he wants to control your checkbook or where you go to work, he's abusing his authority. There was a movement in the 70s called the shepherding movement. And the shepherding movement was one where that was exactly what was done. Pastors would tell people to come wash their car or which job they could have, or even who they could marry or how many children to have. This was considered to be a decision of the shepherd. Now, likewise, and that was an abuse, right? Likewise, if I attempt to exercise undue authority over my family, it's an abuse of power. Some husbands, including myself once upon a time, misunderstand the role of head of the house as one who exercises absolute authority over absolutely everything. And as anyone who's tried this or seen it tried can attest, this doesn't work out very well, right? Now, in many areas where authority is delegated, that authority can be further delegated. For example, the CEO has delegated authority over the company, but he then delegates some of his authority to department heads, right? His or her authority to department heads. The pastor delegates some of his authority to maybe a youth pastor or a head of small groups or a Christian education pastor, right? And as a parent, you may delegate some of your authority over your children. You delegate them maybe to a babysitter or to a daycare or to a school or to an older child to watch the younger children, right? And many kinds of authority you can receive can also be delegated at some level, or another, right? Now, some kinds of authority can't be delegated. Morning, Daryl. Nice to see you. These are primarily areas where your own responsibility can't be escaped. For example, the CEO can delegate some of his authority to department heads, but he can't delegate his entire authority or responsibility. I can't delegate my authority as head of the household precisely because God has said he will hold me responsible. A student can't delegate their homework to someone else. They're not authorized to do that, right? Now, what about violations of delegated authority? What are we to do when those with authority abuse it? In many cases, there's a mechanism for this. In corporations, there's an HR department, right? In churches, there's an elder board. In government, there are oversight committees and ultimately the ballot box and democracies. In policing, there are police oversight boards and internal investigations teams, right? So in a great many areas, there are mechanisms for redress, right? But what about areas where there's no mechanism for redress? Okay, like in China, in Russia, in Saudi Arabia, and in a lot of other dictatorships, there's no mechanism for redress, right? But we have examples of how to handle this in the Bible. In Exodus, 1, verses 15 to 17, it says, "Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shipra and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then he shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive." And the idea here that the Pharaoh had was, if I can kill the male children, then the women will marry Egyptian men, right? And then Egypt will grow and the Hebrews will shrink. He was concerned that the Hebrews were becoming too powerful. Then next in Acts 4, 18 to 20, it says, "So they called them and commanded them not to speak at all, nor to teach in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered and said to them, whether it's right in the sight of God to listen to you more than to God, you judge. For we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard." In the next chapter of Acts, it says, "And when they brought them, they set them before the council, and the high priest asked them, saying, Did we not strictly command you not to teach in this name? And look, you have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and intend to bring this man's blood on us." But Peter and the other apostles said, "We ought to obey God rather than men." It seems to me that civil disobedience may be a Christian obligation in some cases, okay? It's the ultimate carrying out of the first commandment, to have no other gods before me. And we must adopt the attitude of these believers and of those who are in oppressed areas today. For example, the people in China or North Korea, they take great risk to practice the Christian faith, right? In some of the Middle Eastern countries, Christianity is illegal. And people take great risk to have a home church and to, have a Bible, because these things are illegal. Okay, now, these people have decided not to be subject to the governing authorities. And so this is the appropriate role of civil disobedience, is when we have a command of God, something God has asked us to do, we are not to be subject to the governing authorities. We are to be subject to God. Now, the trick here and the potential deception is to confuse obligations to God, imposed by God, with those that we are concerned about or with righting potential wrongs in society. For example, there's now this famous Supreme Court case that just in the last year, maybe it's 2 years, where Coach Kennedy, who's close to me here in Bremerton, Washington, this guy insisted on praying with his football team after the game. And the school district said, no, you can't do that. And Coach Kennedy resisted, and they fired him. So he sued and went all the way to the Supreme Court, and he wanted to ensure his rights under the Constitution to practice his religion. And the Supreme Court agreed. They said, yeah, that's an infringement on your right to religion. Now, if the Supreme Court had disagreed, I think Coach Kennedy would have been right to continue praying anyway, even at great personal risk, even at losing his career. Okay? Now, that said, I think Coach Kennedy would have been incorrect had he insisted that any football player who didn't want to pray with him had prayed with him, if he had insisted that the entire school said prayer with him. Okay. And so this is what the apostles did. They insisted on doing what God had asked them and being obedient to God, but they didn't insist that either the Jewish or the Roman authorities join them in their Christianity, right? And a lot of us who are Christians have worked for years in the pro-life movement, right? And for those of us who live in countries with democratic systems, working for change in a godly direction is a good thing. But it may not be a necessary thing in which to practice civil disobedience. You let your own conscience be your guide on this. For example, for physicians or pharmacists, if they were compelled by law or by their employer to participate in abortion, I think it would be quite appropriate for them to refuse. Extending that into a clinic blockade, or even the clinic bombings or violent targeting of providers, as some have done, I think this is a bridge too far. Now, the dividing line, as near as I can tell, would be in places where Christians are compelled by the government to participate in an evil practice or in direct disobedience to God. God has offered us a lot of direction, and for us not to follow it is, in fact, sinful. James 4:17, he says, therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. Okay, so now some have suggested that withholding taxes, since the government sometimes uses them for evil purposes, that it's okay. Now, I'm going to leave that between you and God, but the Roman government certainly did evil things. And Jesus indicated that his followers were, in fact, to pay their taxes. Now, next verse, we'll jump into verse 3 here. And what it says is, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. So, doing what is right in the eyes of a righteous government is never fear-inducing. Okay? A righteous government is there to minister to you for your good. Evil people should be rightly afraid of a righteous government. The evil person should expect the wrath and the consequences of that same righteous government. And when it says here, Paul says the government does not bear a sword in vain. A sword in this context represents the use of force by government. And this is basically permission, if you will, for the righteous government to use force to compel the punishment of evildoers. And the point of a sword, and forgive the pun, the point is that it can be an instrument of death, right? And this isn't to indicate that every crime should be punished by death. And it's not a discussion about capital punishment, although it might be. But like an officer using his gun as a means of exerting a deadly threat over a criminal to gain compliance, stop or I'll shoot, right? A sword can be used in the same way. And the threat of deadly force compels the criminal who wants to preserve his life into compliance so that they can be fined or jailed depending on the crime, right? Some have said that violence doesn't solve anything. Well, I think this is exactly wrong. The threat of violence is the main method that's been used by governments to gain compliance. For example, if you don't pay your taxes, the first thing that'll happen is you get a letter. Then you'll get another letter. You'll get more letters. You'll get a certified letter. Eventually, you'll probably get sued for those back taxes. At some point, if you don't comply, literally, a man with a gun or a woman with a gun, right? An IRS agent and authorities will show up to take whatever property you have from you and eventually take you to prison. Okay. Now the same process applies for every non-misdemeanor crime. Eventually compliance is gained through threat of force. Okay. And at some point in the lawbreaker's career, they'll be confronted with an officer who wants to arrest them. And resisting arrest in most jurisdictions is an authorized use of force for the officer. And of course, most people follow the law out of a sense of propriety, right? But one has to wonder how many of those people who follow it out of a sense of propriety would behave differently if the power of the state and the threat of violence weren't behind those laws. So next, verse 5, Paul says here, therefore you must be subject not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. And the idea here is that for the unbeliever, it's wrath. It's the sword. It's the threat of violence that often is the thing that gains compliance. But for the believer, we're to do it because of our responsibility before the Lord to do what is right. Okay? Much of the behavior of the Christian should be a response to the cross. Again, no obligation to obey unjust things that would cause you to be out of position with God. We have to obey God instead of men. But the reality is that most laws, most situations don't require us to be disobedient to God, even if we don't like the law very much. Okay? Verse 6, for because of this, you also pay taxes, for they are God's minister attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due. Taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. And this goes right back to the earlier point that we are to pay our taxes and support those who are serving the public in official roles. Okay. Now, owe no one anything except to love one another. For he who loves one another or loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet, and if there's any other commandment, are all summed up in this, namely saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. Now, I think it's reasonable to say that a lot of the great political movements have been rooted in this concept of love your neighbor. The Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence at some level, abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, and the pro-life movement. These are all movements that have been rooted in loving your neighbor. Now, some of these movements have even involved people taking up arms, right? The Revolutionary War and the Civil War both involved, here in the U.S., right, both involved people using violent means to overthrow an existing system. Now, in both cases, it's my view, and I know this won't be popular, that the use of violence was inappropriate. Both of these wars flowed from the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, who was not a Christian, he was a deist, said that men are, quote, endowed by their creator with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson, I believe, was partly wrong. And I know this won't be popular, but only one of these three, life, is rooted in biblical truth. We are commanded not to take life unjustly in the sixth commandment, right? We often hear this commandment recited as thou shalt not kill, but it's more properly rendered, and most of the modern translations use this rendering, you shall not murder. This is Exodus 20:13. And this is easily harmonized with the verse above about the state bearing the sword. When the state uses its power to take the life of a criminal through capital punishment or exercise of police powers, it's not murder. Murder is the unjustified taking of life. We are entitled to life until we surrender it by committing criminal acts, right? We're entitled to life, but we are not promised liberty. Paul says, this is 1 Corinthians 7, verse 20, let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can be made free, rather use it, right? Go ahead. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. So you're free in Jesus, even if you're in slavery. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. In other words, it doesn't matter if you're a slave or a free person. If you're called to be under Jesus, you're called to a life of slavery to Jesus. We are not promised liberty from bondage, liberty from an oppressive government, liberty to do whatever we want as a Christian. We are promised liberty only in the context of doing what Jesus says. That we are free to do. In other words, if Jesus doesn't say it, if God doesn't say to do it, and some other authority compels us, we're compelled to obey that authority unless it's contrary to what God says. Now, we are not promised happiness, right? This thing that Jefferson says, we're endowed with right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We are not entitled to happiness as Christians. Job says, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Even so, I will defend my own ways before him. So Job had his whole family taken from him, everything he had taken from him, and he was definitely not entitled to happiness. Now, some might argue that we're entitled to pursue happiness, but we are not entitled to happiness at the point of using violence to obtain it. And we're not entitled to liberty at the point of using violence to obtain it. Next verse, verse 11, and do this, knowing the time, that it is now high time to awake out of sleep. For now our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Therefore, let us cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. Now, some see an eschatological or end times meaning to this verse. I don't see it that way. I see Paul saying that our lives go quickly, and if we're adults, especially adults of older age, that the day of our salvation is quickly approaching. And here's what I'm certain of. Regardless of whether this verse is about the last days or whether we're in the last days of the earth, I'm pretty certain that I'm in my own last days, right? It's been 50 years since Hal Lindsey wrote The Late Great Planet Earth. And this book, when he wrote it in the 70s, had most people expecting the end of the earth to be in the 80s. Chuck Smith, who's the subject of this great new movie called Jesus Revolution now, wrote a book called 88 Reasons Why Jesus Will Return in 1988. Obviously, Chuck, even though I respect him and had met him once upon occasion, attended his church for 5 minutes 100 years ago, literally back in the 80s, Chuck Smith was wrong about this. And since we don't know and we can't know what the timing of the end of the earth is, it seems to me to be somewhat of an irrelevant point, and probably the one that Paul was unlikely himself to be making. The point here of this verse is that is relevant is that the time from the time that we became Christians to the end of our life is pretty short. And it means that Paul was correct here when he said our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. If you believed yesterday, it's nearer today. And again, whether it's the end times now or not, I think is somewhat irrelevant. By the way, if you're listening to the podcast, please share it on social media. If you're listening to the audio podcast, if you're watching on one of the broadcast channels live or on replay, if you hit the share button, that does help the broadcast to grow. Verse 13, here Paul is wrapping up, and this is a shorter chapter, so it'll be a shorter broadcast today. Let us walk properly, as in the day, not in revelry and drunkenness, not in lewdness and lust, not in strife and envy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts. Now, this also does not fit the idea of liberty. Throughout the writings of Paul, he speaks of himself as a slave of Jesus. We looked at this idea quite a bit in the earlier chapters, especially I think 5, 6, and 7. And he talks a lot about being a slave, chapter 8 even included. And he lists here a few things: revelry, drunkenness, lewdness, lust, strife, and envy. But this is not intended by Paul to be an exhaustive list. What he says here is make no provision for the flesh. This is the opposite of liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Making provision of the flesh and pursuing happiness is totally the opposite of the idea of being a slave of Jesus. Okay, I mean, if you're going to make provision for your flesh and have liberty, that's the opposite of what Paul's saying here, where he says, make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts. For fulfilling our lusts, pursuing our lusts, and it doesn't just mean sexual lust, but things that we want, is making provision for the flesh. It is the pursuit of happiness. And the Christian is committed to being in bondage to Jesus and the pursuit of Jesus's agenda, not our own agenda. Paul says again in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 19 and 20, he says, do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and you are not your own? For you are bought at a price, therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. The idea here is that we don't belong to ourselves. We didn't make ourselves. We didn't save ourselves. We didn't, do anything to merit the favor of God, but we have received it. And as such, since Jesus purchased us with his own blood, we are to be slaves of him and not make provision for our flesh and for pursuing the things that we want as a priority over the things that Jesus wants for us. So with that, we will wrap up today. Again, short chapter. Want to remind you, again, we are listener supported. There are stars on Facebook. You can visit thefootlight.com to support the broadcast. If you have comments or questions, concerns, and I'm sure I'll get some negative feedback on this, call the message line, 866-988-8311, or you can send an email to brian@thefootlight.com. And of course, there are Facebook messages and comments that are welcome. Thanks again. Appreciate it, and appreciate you checking out the Footlight broadcast. Thanks again. And my name is Brian O'Kelly, and Lord willing, I will be back next week, and I think we'll be back on a consistent every Sunday schedule going forward. Should be easy to accomplish, I think, at this point. So thanks again, and Lord willing, I'll see you next week. Lord bless you, and thank you so much. This is The Footlight. I'm Brian O'Kelly.